if you become so protocol driven that you don't have the elasticity in your language to cope with unexpected events, then suddenly you hit the limits like hitting a brick wall, or indeed flying into the ground.
They don't have the standard processes to describe little green men or women flying past in the spaceship. Okay, good.
So I've been looking into the role of, you would call it communication, but I think, as we'll probably end up covering, even the word communication, when you get into the weeds of linguistics, there are limitations, there are qualifications that you need to add to the concept of communication when you're talking about it in relation to language. So yeah, I've been doing a bit of a travel back in time. You know, we talked about the evolutionary anthropology of the ability of the human being to collaborate and work together, distribute tasks, the rudiments, if you like, of teamwork, and how it has its history, its legacy in the way we've evolved as a species. And you can say the exact same about language. And my position, and this is a position that, you know, I would ground in my academic interests, my research. Um, my position is that language has a really foundational role to the way in which we perform teamwork. And it's something that I think probably, when you're talking about team science and the research into teamwork, is that's represented in a variety of ways, to the extent at one end of the extreme, which almost engineers and I don't want to say blindly kind of ignores language, but I would say that there is a certain genre of teams research that likes to conveniently wrap language and communication up into other constructs, as opposed to framing them as fundamental, important features of team dynamics in and of themselves. I definitely sit at the other end of the extreme, which would be to say that language is constitutive of team performance. So you can't really analyze or observe teams in action without focusing in on the language that they use. But what is often, I think, what the way it's often framed is language facilitates things happening in teamwork. And my position would be a little bit different, which would be to say, well, language is the things happening in teamwork. It's not a means to an end. It's a constitutive force.
So you've talked about language and you've talked about communication, and obviously your specialism is around linguistics. One of the questions that I remember asking you was about how much of that is spoken, because obviously, and I know that you'll talk about this later, so you can lead us more into this. But one of the things that I've found really interesting is the increasing prevalence of written communication because of hybrid working. So as we've seen teams progress to asynchronous working, as in we are not in the same place synchronously talking this out in a meeting face to face, communication, it hasn't changed. We've had engineers drawing blueprints for other people to follow. You know, that's a type of communication. So we've always had this asynchronous communication, but it's turned on its head a lot since the pandemic and hybrid working, fully remote working. So obviously, that point that you just made is there's communication and their language, but they're two different things. Communication may not be linguistic.
I'm not a linguist. You know, my research is at the sort of interface between linguistics and sociology. So, you know, I'm not an out and out linguist, and I would be being highly offensive to the colleagues that I work with who are linguists and applied linguists if I were to claim to be that. But you know, that's my area of interest. Well, probably one of the people that you have to talk about when you get into the discussion about the evolutionary dimension to language is a name that loads of people are familiar with, is Noam Chomsky. And you know, you mentioned that the two words, language and communication. So one of the things that Chomsky says is that it's a kind of arguably a fallacy that our capacity for language issues from our more primitive capacities for communication. So, and there are lots of debates in the linguistics field around this stuff, some of which I think it's worthwhile covering. That in itself is an interesting observation to respond to your idea that, well, loads of the ways in which we communicate now are facilitated through information technology. So technology mediated communication, and in fact, there's definitely an argument to say that just in the same way that use of certain words changes languages, emojis have changed the way in which we communicate. Some of the communication technology that have become commonplace for organizational functioning have influenced the way in which language exists. That's true. But I think the interesting thing is actually from the point of view of teamwork, which that's our denominator here. So there's things in Chomsky's research that personally I'm more wedded to some of the other views that are in the debate, but I like the observation that I suppose you could translate what he's saying there is somewhat reductive to suggest that language is just a sophisticated adaptive response to a capacity to communicate. It's far more than that. And I like that because I also think there's a real parallel in the way in which we refer to language and communication in teamwork, which is to say, and you can see why, because ultimately language exists because of our interpersonal dynamics. It's a necessity to function interpersonally. That's what teamwork is, and as I'm fond of saying, I kind of view language as the like the cognitive synapses that we have in our brains for thinking. Language are our synapses in a team. That's what allows us to think as a team is language. But to reduce it down just to communication, just some people would refer to communication as the transfer of information. That is reductive. It's more than that. It's way more than that. It's not just the transfer of information. It's meaning making. It's a facility for identity. It's a form of memory, and much more beyond that. So the importance actually of that observation by Chomsky, and that it doesn't just issue from primitive capacities for communication, I think is really important.
I think it is easy to be, as you say, reductivist about the importance of communication in a team, to think that it's the issuance of objectives, it's the setting of goals, the collaboration, the distribution of tasks, and that's it. But quite rightly, as you say, it's way bigger than that.
Some of the things that I notice in conversations, both in the kind of literature, and then when you get out into the real world and you're speaking to people that are high performing teams working in really high demanding environments, you've got the sort of two ends of the spectrum represented there as well, which is on one hand, they don't realize all of the benefits of sophisticated language in doing those functional communicative things. So on one level, there's a lack of recognition of the role of language in things that sometimes aren't framed as being linguistic or communicative. So, we've talked before about goals. Goal setting can be framed as something incredibly instrumental and functional. And the fact that they exist as a means of communicating something and they are in themselves a communication is sometimes lost. So the reach of the concept and importance and constitutive force of language in team work is not always fully represented. And then on the other end, it's like, well, but it's also not just those things. It's also not just communication. It's about the development of culture. It's about identity, as I say. It's about meaning making. and sense making in the world in which you operate, and all of those things aren't necessarily just about communication. So yeah, there's sort of two ends of the extreme, which is on one end not really not fully fleshing out the role and importance of communication, and then the other end of the extreme is recognizing that it's not just about communication either. Going back to Chomsky, some of the other stuff that I've been looking into is getting into the weeds about the evolutionary story of language, and what significance it holds for what we enjoy and what we value about teamwork in the modern day. If you think about those debates that I mentioned, just trying to quickly represent what is discussed in those circles, in those sort of theoretical linguistic circles that Chomsky occupies and is the most famous voice within, it kind of revolves around a single debate. And I say a disclaimer again, I'm being reductionist here, but it's that debate around, well, where does language come from? Chomsky's position is that there was this kind of gene mutation. I think I would be right to say that he would represent that as a spandrel.
What's a spandrel?
So it's nicked from architecture. I suppose you could call it like an unintended consequence of a set of gene mutations that leads to a different capacity. A supposed example is like feathers in birds evolved to keep them warm, but they happen to be incredibly effective at facilitating flight. So they evolved for one reason, and it gave you a capacity elsewhere. Spandrel in art, it comes from architecture. It's something to do with the negative space between two arches. Anyway, that's what he would claim, is that mutation or step change happened in our genetics, which gave us the facility for language. And it's often referred to as universal grammar. So it's just this sudden capacity for understanding of an infrastructure, set of rules that gives us the ability to abstract and make use of words in a way that gives us this complexity and sophistication of communication that we didn't otherwise have. The alternative view, if I can frame it as that, issues from Steven Pinker's work and Paul Bloom. They would describe it more as a linear evolutionary model of the way in which language came to be. And their argument is that we as animals formed the ability to communicate in the same way that birds can communicate, in the same way that whales can communicate. We have physical vocal apparatus that allow us to make sounds and differentiate those sounds in a way that communicates meaning. And from that apparatus and our need to develop more sophisticated means of collaborating and interacting so that we can survive, we developed language. And you've also got kind of more recent work from Steven Pinker and Ray Jackendoff, who basically kind of maintain that idea that it's a linear evolution. It's evolved from the same physical kit that we've got to make noises and communicate, but we've, on the platform of that, through a coevolution of our brains, is to develop the capacity for language. And the argument against that, from the sort of Chomsky side as well, well, if we've evolved that, why haven't monkeys, chimps, why haven't they developed the ability to create more sophisticated language? So the argument back is essentially like, well, loads of things. There's loads of common parallel evolutionary tracks that don't necessarily causally relate to a further evolutionary step. So just because you might share a great deal of common genes and physical capacities doesn't mean that you're destined to evolve in the same direction. I suppose the the upshot of it either way is that it really is language that has facilitated our capacity for complex idea sharing and sharing ideas, across temporal divides. So the ability that language has to move forward and backwards in time. You can refer to something that happened in the past. You can project forward and anticipate something that might happen in the future. You can refer to what's happening in the present. They seem like quite basic functions of language, but it's actually incredibly sophisticated. In using syntax and semantics, you can order the same building blocks in different ways to represent different time dimensions, different conceptual dimensions, relationships to other people, and all of these things then give you the infrastructure to construct society and innovate around problems and challenges that you face as a collective. I think that's the thing is, from a physical point of view, we are not we're not equipped as predators to adequately dominate other species. We don't have the physical size that other species have. We don't have the venom or the
and the
fangs,
claws.
or to prey on other species. But we have developed the the cognitive functions to organize ourselves in such a way that allows us to dominate. To summarize those two sides, that's what Pinker and his friends would refer to their view as the kind of broad language faculty. So it's this idea that, well, we've gathered a whole load of co-evolving features together around, and they've culminated in the evolution of language. And Chomsky's would be referred to as the narrow language faculty. It was like, well, it's sort of issued from one genomic mutation, and hey presto, we've suddenly got all this equipment. And yeah, there's a great deal of even contemporary research that are trying to prove both things. And I think I'm more aligned to the Steven Pinker, Paul Bloom side of the debate personally. But the point is that a theory is a theory until it's disproven. And the challenges with languages is that it's quite hard to disprove, because you need to sort of probably drill open someone's skull and put some electrodes in and things to get further. Chomsky's theory remains unrefuted. It's not been disproven.
We previously had an episode which was on the history of teamwork. So I think it's season 2, episode 2 of this podcast that deals with a lot of the work of Michael Tomasello, who we're not going to retread any of that ground, but if anybody's listening to this, Chomsky is enormously important. I think it's really important to know where he stands. Tomasello, I think, is much more strongly aligned with Pinker, as you say. Is an evolutionary anthropologist and studied directly how chimps communicated and how young adults communicate. And one of the things that I think we can say, it's not that other animals don't communicate, because clearly they do, and there's very varied and sophisticated methods of communication. Chemical, phytochemical communication. There's body language. You only have to look at how dogs and domesticated animals communicate to see there are hidden signals under there. But for some reason, suddenly the witchcraft of where we are and teamcraft, suddenly for some reason we uniquely develop the sophistication of language that we have today. To us, that's more critical than anything else, although some of those things are really important. Even chemical communication and body language are really important to us, but it really is linguistics that has driven humanity to where it is today.
I don't think linguistics and language gets enough attention. I've mentioned Elizabeth Stokoe before. If you listen to her talk about her frustration, which I share, on how much attention body language gets. But the whole thing about 99% or whatever is communicated through body language, which is A, not what was originally said, and B, fails to mention the important thing, which is that whatever percentage of signals are sent via body language, they only really mean anything in the context of spoken language, of actual linguistics. So, the apparatus and means we have of making sense of the body language is constituted through language. So we don't understand it in the first place without language. We can't share and make sense of it without that. And B, the spoken language that body language relates to is what really tells us something. So I'm not saying that body language isn't important, but it's amazing how quickly we gloss over the depth that is contained within what we say, and by extension of that, what we write, and so on. It's amazing how fast we gloss over it. My dear colleague Claudia Angelelli, who I work with, she's an applied linguist. She often says we've all got teeth, but we're not dentists. And what she means is like because we all speak all the time, it's easy to take for granted what that language represents and the sophistication that exists beneath the surface.
I was just cheekily Googling in the background, so don't assume that I know this. I think that one is Ferris and Marabian and Wiener, so 1967 studies. That seems to be the one that that has the most attention. That 55% of language of communication is body language, 38% is tone of voice, and 7% is the word spoken.
Well, he said himself, like he said himself, he's like it's complete. It's a completely incorrect representation of the research to say that. It's not what was in the paper. And the original source that is attributed to that idea of 90% of communication happening through body language, that is not what the source said. Quite conveniently omits the fact that there is an important linguistic context to any body language that is really what underpins the meaning that you get from it.
It's very similar to our Tuckman research, actually. That you dig into it a little bit more and you find out that there is goodness there, but it's not necessarily what everybody currently understands it to be, and it's so widely dispersed that it's never questioned. Yeah. But anyway, back to linguistics and communication.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things that comes from looking at the evolutionary background to the importance of language and teamwork, and one of the things perhaps that kind of connects it to the present day is about storytelling, and that's a thing that is noted as being this linguistic device that is not. Nowadays, we maybe even kind of associate the concept of storytelling as being a form of entertainment, but storytelling as a device was the way in which people learned. The technological innovation of written language and ways of recording written language, such as books, and then, of course, much more recently, printing press. These are the very tip of the iceberg of our linguistic development. Verbal storytelling being passed between people to warn, the kind of cliched example is, don't eat that flower, don't eat that blue flower because, you'll get sick or you'll die. And the way in which language allows you to create story in such a way that's memorable, that going back to the idea of capturing things like dimensions of time is unique to us. It's not just about, right, so the device existed to pass on lessons from generation to generation or from family to family. It's not just about that. It's also about the co-evolution of our application of storytelling and how that then itself made language evolve into something more sophisticated as well. So H.L. Goodall Jr., Walter R. Fisher, they talk about Homo narrans, the storytelling animal, and trying to bridge that part of the discussion between our evolution and the present day. Storytelling is such a commonly referred to powerful device in contemporary work and business and politics and so on. Our guest on the podcast, Alina, she talked about her her love of the work of Frances Fry, she's done some recent work on the power of storytelling, and I do think it's the ability for lessons and vital information to be packaged in such a way that make them memorable, that make them transferable, that is one of the really powerful features of storytelling, and why it remains such an embedded means of communication.
I was reading something recently that was published by Roger Martin. So Roger Martin is a, a strategy thinker. Playing to Win was one of his big books. He was the dean at the Rotman School at the University of Toronto, and he does these comparisons of his work and other thinkers' work. And he actually did a bit of a tear down of another book that I really like, a book called The Goal by Eli Goldratt. And The Goal is an interesting book. There's nothing groundbreaking in it. It was actually almost rewritten chapter for chapter into a book called The Phoenix Project, which lots of techies will have read. What's really interesting is The Phoenix Project, which went on to sell certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies, largely to people working in tech. The Goal has definitely sold millions of copies, maybe 5 million copies. And it's great. I really enjoyed it. What Roger Martin says is, though that book, particularly The Goal, has sold millions of copies, and it is a parable about something that is taught in the first semester of business school. There's nothing particularly complex or special about what Eli Goldratt is saying. It's just that it is so compelling, so everybody reads it, and I think it just speaks to that importance of storytelling. And I think even today, when you're working with teams, the ability to connect with a team with a story, whether it's one-to-one or with an entire team, to bring something alive with a real example and weave it into a parable, is an incredibly compelling way to share knowledge, to set a shared intent, to build a culture.
Yeah, and it also has the advantage sometimes of being somewhat indirect. I think there are certain things that are it's like some things are dry in substance, or some things are uncomfortable to address, confront, and a story packages those important messages in such a way that you get them, but they arrive in an indirect manner, which means that you're ready to receive them, you're willing to receive them, which I think is quite important. And that the willingness to receive things, I think, somewhat relates to the concept of common ground, and being, able to meet in a place where everyone's ready to engage. And common ground's another really fundamental feature of what makes for effective communication, especially in teamwork. So that's another thing that I've been thinking about a lot, is just the role of language in achieving common ground. And it's something that I don't think it's overlooked. I think what happens is that it's a bit like that we all have teeth, but we're not dentists. It's taken for granted so much that we sometimes fail to acknowledge just how powerful the concept of something like common ground is. Um, and it takes for it to be really disrupted for us to recognize its importance. So, although there's a little bit of a detour, I think it's probably worth it. Some of the work that I'm involved in at the moment is looking at the impact of time delay on communication in deep space. So looking at astronaut communication, particularly between ground crew and astronauts. And when you get into massive long distances in space, you start to get a signal delay. So signal latency, as it's called. If you get as far as Mars, then you've got a 22-minute one-way delay. All of that is, just a bit of contextual information, but you can imagine you've got a crew of pioneering astronauts, 6 of them on their way to Mars. They're sort of two-thirds of the way there. You're mission control in Houston, and you're trying to communicate with them. You want to send them an important message. It's going to take 16 minutes for that message to arrive, and it's then going to take 60 minutes for the message that they respond to you with to arrive back with you. The really pioneering work that's being done in this area is, in my opinion, it's being done by there's a kind of small group of people dotted around the world that are working on it, but research-wise, Uta Fisher, who's Georgia Tech, and Kathleen Mossier, and they're both former NASA researchers, and then a British company called Braided Communications, who are looking at how can technology support in overcoming communication delay. The reason I'm mentioning that is because one of the fundamental things that they've discovered when you start to look at, right, well, what happens when you have communication delay? And, delays can happen over phone lines of fractions of seconds, or they can happen, as, in the case of deep space, over many, many minutes. And one of the really vital areas to try to maintain is common ground. But then the question is, well, what's common ground? What's what do we mean when we say we've got common ground? And it actually relates back to much earlier work that Uta Fisher was also involved in, and I would say arguably the person that's ended up being most associated with this earlier work was Judith Orsanu. And again, this was all done at NASA, so very early 1990s. They did work on what they called shared mental models, shared situational awareness. And they were obviously looking at this in the context of very high functioning teams for space exploration and for aviation. And the whole thing about that is about, do we, through our communication, are we, quote unquote, seeing the same thing? Right? Is the sense that we make of the situation that we find ourselves in aligned in such a way that we are able to work together to deal with it, or solve a problem, or decide on a course of action? And this is, again, another example, I think, of where, when we talk about language and communication and teamwork, this is where we do a leapfrog thing. We skip over important details and move on to something else. So when for example, I'm observing a team in some research that I'm doing, and in the debriefing session, there is a conversation that comes up about a shared mental model. So this Orsanu and Fisher work from very early 90s for NASA. That, it was really obvious you did really good work there. You were using a shared mental model. And the reason we can tell you were using a shared mental model is because it was evident from your practice that you were both working towards the same goal, but you didn't need to communicate. And that's brilliant. Now, there's a problem with the way in which that's framed. And I'm giving a negative example to demonstrate the importance of language in this whole concept. So that example I gave you, you're using a shared mental model so you didn't have to communicate. That is not an untrue statement. That is not a factually inaccurate conceptualization of the idea of a shared mental model. It's in fact what Orsanu and Fisher talk about, is once you get to the kind of high functioning level of having shared situational awareness, you're operating from a shared mental model, mental being the operative word. You require less explicit communication because you are benefiting from implicit communication on the basis of your experience of working together and confronting the same scenario. The bit that's often overlooked when you get into these debriefing scenarios that I'm mentioning, for example, is you only arrive at a high functioning shared mental model that uses implicit communication by going through a process of using explicit communication to develop the shared mental model. And that takes me back to common ground, because that ability to express explicitly what is going on, those are the fundamental ingredients of achieving common ground. And common ground is constituted itself in language. If you don't have the words or the appropriate language and vocabulary to construct explicitly communicated common ground, then you end up with a vacuum of understanding. there's a really lovely book by David Marquet, who was a nuclear submarine captain in the US Navy. And the book's called Turn the Ship Around. I really love the book. It's a book, I would say, probably more presented along the lines of leadership. So, how uh, his reflections on the processes he followed as he took over a submarine, the Santa Fe, which was not performing, and he turned it into one of the highest performing submarines in the whole US fleet. But there's some fascinating stuff to do with teamwork and language covered in the book, which I love. And particularly, it refers to some of the language that Fisher and Orisanu and Mossier have used in their research around common ground. What's really useful for teams to understand is that where you find yourself in need of really effective communication are in times of doubt, ambiguity, and uncertainty. And what you need is a vocabulary and a language that is understood to communicate around those difficult concepts of things like doubt, ambiguity, and uncertainty in a way that allows you to navigate through it effectively. If you don't have it, you end up talking at cross purposes, you narrow the possibilities for the team to successfully come out the other side. And what you're actually trying to do when you confront these things is you're trying to repair. So if you face uncertainty or ambiguity or doubt, what you're trying to do is repair it to a point where you know the way forward. And the funny thing that I see, so if I watch so some other work that I'm doing looking at medical teams, what you very often find is that they go in loops of that high performing shared mental model. We know what we're doing. We know the management process for this particular problem. I know that you know that I know that we know what we need to do. So we're going to do it. You take gas measurements, so samples of their vitals. I'll order this prescription. You do that. Blah blah blah. When they encounter uncertainty, suddenly they loop back around to this. Okay, we need explicit communication because we don't know. We don't have a set up means of dealing with this, and that's when suddenly you need that sophisticated, nuanced language to repair the uncertainty. The question comes back to common ground: is do you have a language in your team that gives you the means to confront these sorts of situations? If you've not talked about it, again, the word talk comes in. So like you need to use your communication to address issues of lack of communication. If you haven't talked about those issues, then you fail to identify where you'll be able to reach common ground. I have a completely unrelated but really interesting example from other research that I did, and it was looking at in the entrepreneurship world. So with my fantastic colleagues, Lucrezia Casuli and Stephen Knox. So we looked at entrepreneurs, and we looked at like tech kind of entrepreneurs and art-based entrepreneurs. And the really interesting thing we found was the art entrepreneurs found it really difficult to access and identify with the support resources that are available to them to move their endeavors forward. And the reason for that is because all of the support services are grounded in the language of high tech, high growth, quintessential entrepreneurship, right? Silicon Valley, blah, 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 blah. So they didn't have common ground in language with the resources that are available to support them. The things that they were doing were exactly the same as the high tech companies, but the resources and the support spoke the language of the high tech entrepreneurs. So the high tech entrepreneurs found it very easy to communicate with all those support resources because they had common ground in language. as soon as the support people were talking about market capitalization or your raised targets or this, that, and the other, all of this language was kind of anathema to an artist who's still trying to create a market for their product to sell it. But market, product, and selling are none of those words are things that artists tend to identify with in their endeavors. The result was no common ground. The result was no support or less support, or support that was accessed in a far more difficult way than the high tech people. It's very interesting. It's like an example of that kind of lack of common ground leads you to problems, and that was a thing that David Marquet found in his work on turning the ship around in a submarine. Was let's find common ground for problems. Let's find common ground for ambiguities. Going right down to the detail of the role of one word in creating common ground. They talked about shutting valves instead of closing valves because close sounds like blow, and blowing a valve is the opposite of closing a valve.
That would be a bad decision.
We take for granted that these important features are built into our language, and it's language that we have chosen to achieve common ground. So going back to aviation, it's why if you hear a pilot communicating with the ground and they're identifying themselves and their flight number has a 9 in it, they don't say 9, they say niner, because it makes it difficult to confuse. It's why horizontal distance and vertical distances are use different units of measurement in aviation, because if you're talking about kilometers or you're talking about feet, you don't have to distinguish whether you're talking about vertical or lateral, because if it's in kilometers, then it's horizontal. If it's in feet, it's in vertical distance. And these are deliberate mechanisms built into language to allow us to achieve common ground and understanding.
One of the things that stands out, and you said almost exactly what I was thinking as you were describing it, that the existence of common ground means that you require less explicit communication. I train a lot of teams how to do incident management. And one of the defining characteristics of those teams is that they are generally not in a crisis. So they are not in uniformed services, they're not in accident and emergency. So those teams require specific drilling, and I use that word very specifically because people in uniform services, in kitchens, and a lot of other high stress environments drill regularly to build common ground. But what happens in these organizations is they don't have, maybe it is the shared mental model to start with, but building the common ground, building the habitual processes that are used. And so after a little while, so generally if I'm teaching people how to do incident response, I encourage them to declare an incident at any moment. The drop of a hat, you declare an incident, because then you practice it in a low stress situation, because the last thing that you want to do is, exactly as you said, be trying to develop the common ground in the high stress situation and not understand that everybody has the shared mental model that has the shared common ground. So what you see in those situations is communication is very explicit and starts looking very military. You start seeing people handing over ownership. I'm in control, you're in control. It sounds almost exactly like a pilot handing over to another pilot. And that's just in a tech situation. But the other situation, which I think is really interesting, is how impactful somebody joining a team that already has a really cohesive common ground, because suddenly it destroys it. And what I see happen a lot in that situation is the assumption of shared common ground can be really divisive in that team. Not only does it leave the outsider, the new joiner, as somebody that then has to learn that, but it can also lead to mistakes, because there's an assumption that that person has the same common ground, but they don't have the shared mental model. They haven't learned it yet. And so that can lead, because the communication isn't explicit, because there is an assumption of common ground, that's where mistakes happen.
Yeah, there's another conversation to be had sometime about the two-way relationship there between when a new member joins the team, the introduction of a new team member changes language, but that team member also has to integrate to the kind of prevailing linguistic approaches of the team that they join. Somehow they need to meet in the middle. I think one of the biggest problems that exists is simply a lack of recognition of that process, and a little bit of an entrenched attitude of, well, they just need to assimilate entirely 100% to the way we do things. I thought I might end with telling you some of my favorite things that, if we're trying to get into the strict communicative devices that do exist, that sometimes we, by having a language that allows us to differentiate between them, we understand their role in performing teamwork. And although it's a little bit of a false ending, it brings us to a nice conclusion. Going back to my fandom of the work of Judith Orsanu, Uta Fisher, Kathleen Mossier, so they've done a lot of stuff, and they've looked at, for example, I think where it interfaces with my research activities. So the crossover between aviation and healthcare, for example. But I particularly like some of the things that they've identified in what we have learned from aviation. The only thing I would caveat this with is I do sometimes think that in aviation, it's like an amazing achievement what we've done with communication in aviation, and at the same time, sometimes it takes away, it sanitizes what language really is. In a way, what we've done is we've created artificial intelligence with humans in aviation. Like, it's so highly protocol driven to such an effective and safe extent that we can put two pilots who've never flown together before in a cockpit and they'll just do it beautifully. The problem is that if you become so protocol driven that you don't have the elasticity in your language to cope with unexpected events, then you suddenly you hit the limits, like hitting a brick wall, or indeed flying into the ground.
They don't have the standard processes to describe little green men or women flying past in the spaceship. That's
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, good.
Exactly. So, but that aside, I say that with a little bit of my tongue in cheek, but some of the things that I think have been really usefully identified in practice in the cockpit are things like what pilots understand that they're doing when they say things. So things like they would call obligation statements and preference statements. And these are really useful things for any team to think about in their language. The important thing about an obligation statement is that you express it in such a way that protects the integrity of the team in the content of how you phrase it. They talk about, in an aviation context, we probably need to deviate about now. That's an example of an obligation statement, is that we, the team, I'm presenting to you a course of action that we ought to take, in my opinion. And that can also be things like preference statements. So I think it would be better for us if we did X or Y. So understanding that there are things such as obligation and preference statements where you are presenting these things is quite useful to know that's the category into which they belong. And when I do that, that's what I'm trying to achieve. But you then have resource or task allocation statements. And I think one of the things that sometimes gets mixed up is an obligation statement is considered to be, from the person who makes the statement, that's considered to also be a resource or a task allocation statement. And if there isn't common ground, an understanding in how these things work, then if I make an obligation statement to you and I expect you to understand from that I'm also allocating the resource or the task to you in so doing, we start to lose our common ground, because I, by making an obligation statement, think that I've said, oh, I think we need to deviate around about now. In a work context, I think we need to follow up on that inquiry from that client. If I assume by saying that I'm allocating the task to you, and you assume by doing that you're just presenting us with an obligation, suddenly we lose focus and common purpose.
Yeah, that sort of obligation statement, it feels like there's still things to look into in there. We probably should doesn't feel very obligatory. That was the thing that popped into my head about how explicit you can be in the language. But I think breaking things into those two categories, or throw the three categories, the obligation, preference, and then the resource allocation, I think is probably extremely useful for a lot of teams to consider.
Yeah, and you can package them in a three. So the obligation, the preference, and the task allocation. I think we ought to get back to that client about that inquiry. I would prefer it if we did it within the next 2 days, and I would like you to do it.
One of the things I've said to a team recently is if you're asking for help, you need to say explicitly what you want, who you want to help with it, so that they can either agree or disagree, and when it needs to be completed by. And they're sort of the three component parts of a request. Is if you don't have those three things, then it's not going to happen, because you're missing something crucial out of that communication.
Absolutely. And I think another time I'd love to do a further deep dive into that work Fisher, Orisanu, Mossier, and colleagues have done, because it's really fascinating, and it has consequences for teams in all kinds of contexts, not just in those sort of high reliability, high stakes, safety driven contexts.
We'll definitely make room for that. There's so many things there, and I think as well, the particularly on David Marquet's work on Turn the Ship Around, I'm pretty sure we've already got an episode scheduled coming up in the weeks ahead that we'd like to do on that one as well. And that's it for Teamcraft today. Thanks to everyone for listening. Importantly, thanks to Andrew for doing all the hard work in that episode. Andrew mentioned a number of key references: Noam Chomsky, Stephen Pinker to Fisher, Judith Erasanu, Elizabeth Stokoe, and so many more. We've listed all the references that Andrew made and some of their key works in the show notes, so do check that out. Until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.